The haunted house. The neighborhood was old, older than most parts of Chicago. Brick sidewalks cracked with time, lampposts that still carried faint traces of soot from a fire decades ago, and houses that leaned slightly, as though weary from holding the secrets of generations. But none drew more whispers than the house at the end of Willowbrook Street. It wasn't the largest house, nor the most broken, yet it had an air that made people cross the road rather than walk past it. Shutters hung crooked, peeling white paint revealed gray wood beneath, and ivy crept up its walls like green veins strangling the house itself. Kids dared each other to run up and touch the door, but few had the courage. The old women sitting on porches shook their heads, muttering stories of curses and restless spirits. "Don't go near that place after dark," one woman would say. "The last family that stayed there never made it through winter," another whispered. The stories had roots: strange deaths, unexplained fires, police reports filed late at night about screams no one could locate. But stories alone never scared Irfan. He was a stubborn man in his 30s, practical, skeptical, and determined never to be ruled by superstition. When his wife, Miriam, begged him to find another house, he laughed it off. "It's cheaper than anywhere else in the area," he argued. "Haunted? Please. If ghosts were real, they'd be paying rent too." Their 2 children, a boy of 10 and a girl of 7, weren't as convinced. On moving day, the little girl clung to Miriam's leg, whispering, "Mama, I don't like the windows. They're looking at me." Irfan brushed it aside. He wanted stability, a home of his own, and he wasn't going to let old wives' tales ruin that. To reassure his wife, he went a step further. He installed CCTV cameras in every main room, along the hallways and outside the front and back doors. "If anything happens," he declared proudly, holding up the monitor that displayed all the feeds at once, "we'll know. No one can sneak around here. Not a thief, not a stranger. Nothing." Miriam only nodded, though her eyes darted nervously toward the living room window, where a curtain shifted without a breeze. The first nights were unsettling. Not terrifying, not yet, but strange enough that Miriam kept bringing them up, and Irfan kept brushing them away. Footsteps echoed across the wooden floorboards at odd hours. Once, Miriam swore she heard someone pacing in the attic. Irfan checked, nothing but dust and cobwebs. Doors sometimes refused to stay closed. The children complained that the upstairs bathroom door clicked open on its own, even after being locked. "Old hinges," Irfan explained. "This house is 100 years old. Wood expands, contracts. That's it." But the CCTV cameras began to tell a different story. The first time Irfan noticed, it was late at night while reviewing footage out of boredom. In the living room feed, around 2:37 a.m., the screen flickered, just once, for a fraction of a second. In that flash, it looked like a shape crossed in front of the couch. Not a person, not exactly, but darker than shadow, moving too smoothly, too deliberately. Irfan frowned, rewound, slowed it down. He told himself it was a glitch, a trick of the cheap camera's software. And yet, when he leaned close to the monitor, he swore he saw a pair of faintly glowing spots where eyes should be. He didn't tell Miriam. As days turned into weeks, the house settled into a routine of unease. The children avoided the basement, saying it smelled like something rotten. Lights flickered more often than they should. At night, when the wind was still, the faint sound of whispering drifted through the vents, like voices carried on a current of air that shouldn't exist. One evening, Irfan sat alone in the living room, scrolling on his phone, when he felt it for the first time, the drop in temperature. Not a gentle chill, but a sudden, bone-deep cold that seemed to seep through his skin. He rubbed his arms and glanced at the thermostat, normal. Yet he could see his breath fogging faintly in the air. Then the living room CCTV camera, mounted high in the corner, clicked softly as though adjusting focus. He looked up at it. For just a moment, he thought he saw movement in its lens, a flicker, like someone standing directly beneath it. He snapped his gaze around the room. Empty, but the sense of being watched crawled over him, prickling the back of his neck. Miriam, meanwhile, grew restless. She begged him again to move. "Irfan, I don't feel safe here. The children have nightmares every night. I hear things when you're asleep. Please, this house isn't right." Irfan tried to stay firm, but even he was beginning to feel cracks in his confidence. He told himself it was just stress, just the power of suggestion, but the cameras kept catching things. On one feed, a chair in the kitchen shifted 2 inches across the floor when no one was home. On another, the upstairs hallway, a dark blur moved past the children's room at 3 a.m. The children were asleep in bed. Every time Irfan reviewed the footage, his stomach tightened. He wanted to delete it, to pretend it wasn't real. But some instinct made him save the files, copying them onto a USB drive and tucking it in his desk drawer. He told himself it was for evidence that ghosts didn't exist, that there was always a rational explanation. But the pit in his stomach whispered otherwise. One night, the entire family sat in the living room watching TV. The glow lit their faces while the shadows of the room stretched long and uneasy. At 9:14 p.m., just as the credits of a show rolled, the power flickered. The TV shut off. The lights went black. Only the tiny red LED of the CCTV camera glowed in the corner, recording silently. The children cried. Miriam clutched them close, her voice shaking. Irfan scrambled for a flashlight, muttering curses. After a long 30 seconds, the power returned, lights buzzing back to life. But Miriam swore she had seen something in the darkness, a tall figure standing near the window. She described it in a hushed voice, her face pale. It was just standing there, Irfan, watching us, its eyes red like coals. Irfan insisted it was her imagination. But when he checked the camera footage later, his blood ran cold. The blackout had lasted 30 seconds. In that time, the footage wasn't just black. Faint outlines were visible, grainy but unmistakable. A tall, shadowy figure in the corner, its head tilted unnaturally toward the family. When the lights came back on in the footage, the figure vanished. That night, Irfan didn't sleep. He sat staring at the monitor, the live feeds from every room glowing in shades of gray. Midnight came and went. At 2 a.m., he nearly dozed off when a flicker caught his eye. The living room camera. For the briefest second, a shape moved across the screen. It paused, turned slowly toward the camera, and two faint red dots shimmered like burning embers. Irfan's breath hitched. He leaned forward, heart pounding. And then, without warning, the camera feed cut to static. The next few days blurred together in a haze of unease. Irfan moved through his routine, work, family, checking the cameras before bed, but the cracks in his skepticism deepened. Every review of the CCTV feeds revealed something he couldn't explain. A door opening by itself, shadows where no one stood, and once, a faint whisper caught on the audio feed that almost sounded like his own name. Miriam grew colder toward him, exhausted from pleading to leave. Their children, pale with constant nightmares, began sleeping together on the floor of their parents' bedroom. The house was no longer just a home. It was a cage of dread. But Irfan clung to reason like a drowning man to driftwood. He convinced himself that the disturbances had explanations. He had to. To admit otherwise was to admit he had dragged his family into something beyond his control. Then came the night Kashif visited. The arrival. It was late, nearly midnight, when the doorbell rang. Irfan, hunched over the CCTV monitor in his study, startled at the sound. He checked the feed before answering, habit now ingrained. On the screen, he saw his friend Kashif standing on the porch, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, stamping his feet against the cold Chicago night. Kashif was the kind of friend who carried laughter with him wherever he went. They'd grown up together, survived schoolyard fights, scraped through college exams, and shared countless late-night meals at greasy diners. When Irfan opened the door, Kashif grinned wide. "Man, you look like hell," Kashif said, stepping inside. "What? This house keeping you up at night?" Irfan chuckled weakly. "Something like that. Come in." The two settled into the living room, the soft hum of the CCTV camera watching from above. Kashif lit a cigarette, the glow briefly illuminating his face. Smoke curled lazily toward the ceiling. "So," Kashif said, exhaling, "how's the haunted house treating you?" Irfan rolled his eyes. "Don't start with that crap. You sound like Miriam." Kashif smirked. "Maybe your wife's just smarter than you." Despite the banter, Irfan's nerves itched. The presence of his friend was comforting, yet it also made the silence of the house feel heavier, as though the walls themselves listened. The first signs. The camera feed recorded it all. Two men talking, smoke drifting, timestamp glowing in the corner. At first, it was ordinary. Then, without warning, Kashif shivered. "Damn, it just got cold in here," he muttered, rubbing his arms. Irfan frowned. He felt it too, the sudden, unnatural chill that spread like frost through the air. He glanced at the thermostat across the room. Normal. Always normal. "Old house," Irfan said automatically, though his voice carried little conviction. Kashif flicked ash into a tray, eyes narrowing. "You don't hear that?" "Hear what?" The room fell silent. And then a faint sound, like a sigh carried through the vents. Not wind. Not pipes. A sigh. Irfan's throat tightened. He forced a laugh. It's nothing. You're letting the stories get to you. But his eyes betrayed him, darting toward the camera in the corner. The lens blinked, adjusted. The mist. The cigarette smoke no longer curled naturally. It began to drift sideways, pulled toward the far corner of the room, gathering unnaturally in a thickening swirl. Kashif frowned, leaning forward. What the hell? The footage showed it clearly. The smoke thickened, pooling into a fog that sank instead of rising. It spread across the floor in tendrils, reaching toward the couch like grasping fingers. Kashif stood abruptly. Irfan, I'm not crazy, look at that. Irfan rose too, heart hammering. It's maybe a draft. The vents. But even as he said it, he knew the lie was thin. The mist didn't behave like air. It moved. The timestamp on the footage ticked forward, 12:17 a.m., as the fog grew darker, heavier. The presence. On the footage, the mist began to take shape. At first, only a vague outline. Then, as seconds crawled like hours, a form emerged. Tall. Broad shoulders. A head bowed unnaturally low. The living room lights flickered, shadows stretching across the walls. Kashif's cigarette slipped from his fingers, smoldering on the carpet. His lips parted, but no words came. His eyes widened, fixed on the corner of the room. Irfan followed his gaze and froze. There, where the mist had gathered, something stood. Not entirely solid, not entirely smoke. Its body rippled as though struggling to remain in this world, but its presence was undeniable. Two glowing eyes, red, sharp, merciless, burned in the darkness. Kashif stumbled backward. No, man. Tell me you see that. Irfan's jaw worked, but no sound came. His skepticism shattered like glass. He saw it. He couldn't deny it. The knife. On the CCTV footage, the figure raised one arm. In its hand gleamed a knife, not old, not rusty, but sharp, metallic, catching the dim light with a sickening gleam. Kashif's breath came in ragged gasps. He turned toward Irfan, desperate. We need to get out. The words cut off in a strangled gasp as the figure took a step forward. The floorboards creaked beneath its weight, though its body was only shadow. Irfan's instincts screamed to run, to flee, but his legs locked in place. Kashif backed away, knocking into the couch. His face was pale, sweat dripping down his temple despite the icy air. Do something, he shouted, voice cracking. But Irfan could do nothing. The camera caught his terror, frozen, as the figure advanced. The closing trap. The house seemed to shift. Every exit felt impossibly far, the air pressing down like a suffocating blanket. The mist rose higher, swirling around Kashif's legs. He stumbled, coughing, his eyes darting wildly toward the door, the window, anywhere but the thing in the corner. The figure tilted its head, as if savoring the fear. Slowly, deliberately, it began to move. Step by step. The knife gleaming. On the camera, the timestamp flicked to 12:19 a.m. And then, just before the figure reached Kashif, the footage glitched, static bursting across the screen. For 2 long seconds, nothing was visible but white noise. When the picture returned, the figure was directly behind Kashif, towering, its blade poised. Irfan's voice finally broke free. Kashif! But it was too late. The figure raised the knife higher, glowing eyes fixed on its victim. And Kashif turned, his face twisted in horror, just as the first strike came down. The living room filled with a scream that no camera could ever truly capture. The living room camera flickered slightly, a faint static haze running across the screen, as though the system itself could sense what was about to happen. Kashif leaned back on the worn-out sofa, a half-burnt cigarette dangling between his fingers. He exhaled a lazy puff of smoke, his eyes drifting around the dimly lit room. The silence was heavy, only broken by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Then, without warning, the air shifted. The curtains that had hung still for hours suddenly fluttered, though every window was shut tight. A draft of icy wind swept across the room. Kashif shivered, rubbing his arms. What the hell, he muttered. The camera captured the moment the temperature visibly dropped. The glass of water on the table fogged over with condensation, and Kashif's breath turned into faint white mist. And then it began. From the corner of the room, where the shadows were thickest, something started to form. At first it was subtle, a flicker, a distortion like smoke curling in on itself. But then it grew darker, heavier, until a shape began to take form. The footage revealed what no human eye was ever meant to see, a figure pulling itself out of nothingness. Its body was not flesh but pure darkness, writhing like liquid shadows, stretching upward until it towered over Kashif. Kashif froze, his cigarette dropping onto the floor. His wide eyes locked onto the figure, and his face turned pale. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound escaped. The entity tilted its head unnaturally, as though studying its prey. Two glowing red eyes pierced through the darkness, and in its hand materialized something sharp, gleaming in the dim light. A knife. The camera's time-stamp blinked 2:47 a.m. as the horror unfolded. The shadow lunged forward with terrifying speed. The knife slashed downward, plunging into Kashif's chest. He let out a strangled gasp, clutching the wound as blood spurted onto the sofa. The CCTV recorded every second in chilling clarity. Kashif struggled, thrashing violently, trying to fight off the impossible attacker. His hands went through the figure as though grabbing at smoke, yet the knife felt real, painfully real. Each strike drove deeper, tearing through flesh. Slash. Stab. Slash. Blood sprayed across the carpet, splattering onto the camera lens for a split second before sliding down. Kashif fell onto the floor, twitching, gasping for air. His body convulsed as the shadow knelt over him, driving the knife again and again, as though feeding on his fear and pain. His eyes filled with tears, and a faint gurgle left his throat before silence began to creep in. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the figure froze. Its head slowly turned, not toward Kashif, but toward the camera. The footage showed the shadow rising to its full height, blood dripping from the knife that glimmered in the dim light. Its glowing red eyes locked onto the lens, unblinking, filled with a terrifying intelligence. The camera glitched, lines of static crawling across the screen, but one detail was unmistakable. The ghost knew it was being watched. And then, as if mocking the very existence of the CCTV, the figure raised the knife one last time, and slowly dragged the blade across its own chest, carving into the smoky darkness before fading back into the mist. Silence. The room was left in chaos, blood pooling on the floor, Kashif's lifeless body sprawled motionless, and the faint flicker of static as the camera returned to normal. But the last recorded seconds were the most haunting. The mist hadn't fully disappeared. It lingered, swirling, shifting, almost as if waiting. And in the corner of the frame, barely visible, two glowing red eyes shone faintly in the darkness, unblinking, watching the empty room. The sun rose over Chicago, but the house on Ashland Street remained locked in silence. Police tape stretched across the doorway, yellow and fluttering in the cold morning wind. Inside, the air still carried the metallic scent of blood, the kind that clung to walls and seeped into floorboards. Detectives had already combed through the rooms, snapped photos, gathered samples, but the truth of what had happened remained buried in shadows. Irfan sat on the front steps, his hands trembling as he held the USB drive. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the footage over and over. The mist, the figure, the knife, Kashif's final scream that never came out. Each time he pressed play, it was like peeling back a layer of reality he wished he had never seen. Neighbors gathered across the street, whispering to each other, crossing themselves, some shaking their heads. Everyone had known the house's reputation. They had warned him, and now one of their own lay dead. But what truly terrified Irfan was not Kashif's death, it was the end of the video. That moment when the figure turned, its glowing eyes locking onto the lens. Locking onto him. The return to the house. 3 days later, after the police released the property back to him, Irfan returned. His family refused to set foot inside again. His wife had taken the children and gone to her sister's place. He didn't blame her, but he needed answers. He needed proof that he wasn't losing his mind. The house creaked as he pushed the door open. Sunlight filtered in through broken blinds, casting jagged stripes across the floorboards. The stains from Kashif's blood had been scrubbed away, but to Irfan, they might as well still be there. He could see them, smell them, feel them. Carrying a small laptop, he went straight to the living room. He plugged in the USB drive, pressed play, and forced himself to watch every second again. The mist, the form, the stabbing, it was all there, undeniable. But then something new happened. The figure, as it turned toward the camera, seemed to move differently this time, almost as if the recording itself had changed. Its glowing red eyes burned brighter, and its face, or what passed as a face, twisted into something more human, more grotesque. It raised its knife slowly, pointing it not at Kashif, but at the camera. Irfan's heart pounded in his chest. He slammed the laptop shut, his breath ragged. The video was not just a recording. It was alive. The haunting escalates. That night, Irfan tried to sleep in the guest bedroom, but the house wouldn't let him. At first, it was the small things, soft footsteps in the hallway, the creak of the staircase, faint whispers like wind through a keyhole. But then came the smell of smoke, acrid and choking. He stumbled out of bed, coughing, searching for fire, but the house was cold, dark, untouched. When he looked back at the hallway mirror, his blood ran cold. Behind him, just over his shoulder, stood the shadow figure. Its glowing eyes pierced through the reflection, even though the hallway itself was empty when he turned around. Irfan dropped the mirror to the floor, shards scattering everywhere. That was the final straw. He couldn't take it anymore. He decided he would leave the house, abandon it forever. But when he tried to open the front door, the handle wouldn't turn. The locks wouldn't budge. Every window was sealed as if by invisible hands. The house wasn't letting him go. The final recording. Desperate, Irfan set up one last camera in the bedroom and kept the laptop open. He wanted to capture proof that could convince the world, and maybe himself, that he wasn't insane. Midnight came. The room grew icy cold, his breath visible in the air. The mist began to seep in through the cracks of the walls, swirling, growing denser. The figure emerged again, taller, darker, its knife glistening like wet steel. This time, it didn't go for Kashif. Kashif was already gone. This time, it went for Irfan. The footage, later found on the USB drive, showed him backing into a corner, screaming for help. The shadow lunged, pinning him to the ground, the knife rising and falling with horrifying force. Blood sprayed across the camera lens. The screams cut off abruptly. And then, the same moment again. The figure slowly turned, staring into the camera, staring at whoever dared to watch. Its eyes glowed brighter than ever, filling the entire screen with red. The recording ended there. Aftermath. Weeks later, neighbors reported the house abandoned once again. The police found no trace of Irfan, no body, no blood, no signs of struggle. Only the USB drive sitting neatly on the table, as if placed there on purpose. The footage circulated secretly among investigators, urban legend enthusiasts, and paranormal forums. Each person who watched it claimed the same thing. When the figure turned to face the camera, its eyes didn't just stare. They moved, following the viewer. And sometimes late at night, the glowing red eyes blinked. Epilogue. The haunted house on Ashland Street still stands, crumbling more with each passing year. Few dare to walk past it. Even fewer dare to look inside. But the USB drive still exists, hidden away somewhere in Chicago. And if you ever stumble upon it, if you ever press play, you might just find the figure waiting for you. Its knife gleaming, its eyes burning, its stare locked onto yours. Because the ghost isn't trapped in the house anymore. It's trapped in the recording. And once you watch it, it knows you. This was Dark Story, and some recordings should never be seen.